Hello again, I'm Áine Lawler and I'm your moderator for this afternoon's dialogue, the third in a series of 4 national dialogues that will all be feeding into that United Nations Food Systems Summit in the autumn. Our first 2 dialogues, which are both, by the way, available to watch back on the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine's YouTube channel, they discussed Ireland's 2030 Agri-Food Strategy. Last week, the theme was health and well-being, not just in more nutritious and more sustainable food production, but also in sustaining the communities that produce that food. So this afternoon, our focus is going to be on change through the innovation of science and technology and how that will change the foods we eat and the way we produce them, and also by listening to the voices of young people, the food producers and consumers of the future who are demanding and driving change in our food systems. And once again, we have 2 great panels for our discussions, a brilliant keynote speaker in Dr Colin Sage, and in a moment I'll hand you over to the chairperson of this afternoon's dialogue. She's Deputy Chief Veterinary Officer, Dr Paula Walsh. The key point is we want to hear from you, so please send us your questions and comments and reactions, and we'll be feeding those into our dialogues with our panels. We're using Slido today, so please join in the conversation online. Simply take out your smartphone and open your browser. Go to slido.com, enter our event code, which is #foodsystems. You can now ask questions and vote for the ones you like. And we've started with the following question, which will be one of the questions we'll put to our first panel. So how would you describe the connection between the rural agri-food producing community and urban consumers? And that's going to be a big theme of that conversation. We want to know what you think. Is it excellent? Most Irish people have a strong connection to our agricultural tradition. Do you think it's good but it's declining, or good and it's getting stronger? Do you think it's poor that urban consumers have no appreciation of agri-food production? So we want to hear from you. As I say, we'll be feeding your results into that panel discussion. And for more information on Ireland's food system and the UN Food Systems Summit this year, visit gov.ie/food systems, where you can also register for our forthcoming and final dialogue. The public consultation on the environmental assessment of the draft Agri-Food Strategy 2030 is now open until June the 15th. Go to gov.ie/consultations to have your say. We look forward to hearing from you. And let's get today's dialogue underway now. And to do that, I'm going to hand you over to our chairperson this afternoon, the Deputy Chief Veterinary Officer, member of the Food Safety Consultative Council of the Food Safety Authority. Please welcome Dr Paula Walsh.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's with great pleasure that I welcome you today to the 3rd Irish National Dialogue, Promoting an Inclusive Food System for the Future. My name is Paula Walsh, and I'm the Deputy Chief Veterinary Officer, and I'm involved in the One Health approach for animal health, public health, food safety and food authenticity. I wish to thank the conveners today for asking me to be your chair. As those of you who have attended previous dialogues will know, these dialogues are part of a continuum of Ireland's engagement with the UN Food Systems Summit in September this year. The UN seek to revitalise and invigorate the aim to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN by awakening the world to the challenges facing us across our current framework of production, processing and consumption of food. Our understanding of what a sustainable food system would look like has grown over the last 2 dialogues. We recognise the complexities, the contradictions, and indeed even the apprehension that the discussion engenders. The need for transformation has been stated. The fact that there is a burning bush and no time to lose is acknowledged. We face a critical time, and our actions will impact future generations. However, the ongoing crisis of COVID-19, as well as Brexit, serve as illustrations of determination and resilience that may hearten us as we face these challenges. It is agreed that a sustainable food system has to consider vital components across the economic, social and environmental aspects. Under the model, producers must flourish, people must be nourished, and the environment must be revitalised. I have no doubt that today's dialogue will prove to be a positive addition to the overall discussion on food systems, ultimately provoking the necessary conversations that will allow progress on the goals. Parallel to the UN food system dialogues here in Ireland, we have our own consultation on our draft Agri-Food Strategy for 2030. This Agri-Food Strategy sets out Ireland's vision for how we will become a world leader in sustainable food systems over the next decade, through a shared collaboration across all sectors of society, all strata of the agri-sector, and of course, including the consumer. This ambition is challenging, and today we are here to examine how Ireland can progress its journey, and in particular, how we can achieve an inclusive model across the generations, as well as across the urban-rural divide. In addition, we will explore the importance of research and innovation, and how it will act as a driver to the necessary transformation of our sustainability model. To open today's event, I have the pleasure of welcoming our keynote speaker, Dr Colin Sage, who worked with UCC and is now an independent scholar based in Portugal. He has long experience in food systems, with a particular interest in social justice and environmental and food policy. And I will look forward to his views on how current policy has impacted our society and our planet. He has keen interest in how policy can lead to transformation and social change, and we look forward to his learnings on that front. Our first panel will address the influence of young people in shaping the future of sustainable food systems. The necessary transformation cannot happen without the voice of our youth, as they are the ones who will be most negatively impacted if we fail in our commitments. We hear frequently of how we are losing our ecosystems, but for some of our youths, they feel that they may never have time to experience the ecosystems which many of us have enjoyed during our lifetime. If we think there is a burning bush, it is they who will feel the flames. The panel will also address the oft-referenced urban-rural divide, the lost connection between urban populations and their food. Does it matter? If so, how does it matter? This also appears to have generational context, with younger people no longer being exposed to farming ways, but needing education to understand from where their food comes. We will hear of the challenges that presents, and I hope, ideas on ways to move forward. Our second panel will be discussing research and innovation, the pathway from thought to research, from research to findings, from findings to application, to policy, and then policy to transformation. However, it is not as simple as it sounds. But the knowledge gleaned by research will play an indispensable role in constructing the toolkits for the production models of the future. Collaboration and inclusion mechanisms across government, private investment, state bodies, farmers, processors, and other actors will need to be clarified and maximised for social benefits. It has been said before, but I will repeat it: consensus is not the aim at these dialogues. Open and honest questions and views are needed, with all perspectives on the table. I would encourage you all today to send questions to your moderator and to contribute to answer the Slido questions. Without further ado, I will now ask Dr. Colin Sage to take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Barry Walsh, for that warm introduction. I'd like to acknowledge, first of all, the department's willingness to address the matter of inclusion as part of this dialogues process. It's a topic that often may fall off the agenda when compared to, say, the imperative of economic growth when we're thinking about our food system. So I'm going to begin by giving some context about why inclusion is so vital. And I have to say, I'm likely to do this in a provocative and controversial kind of a way, because these are questions, as Dr. Barry Walsh said, we're not looking for consensus, we're looking to maintain and develop a conversation around some of these issues. And so thinking about a food system for the future surely has to be not only inclusive, but a more sustainable and healthier one. So taking as my point of departure, I want to just make reference to the draft Agri Strategy for 2030. We might first of all reflect on the state of food security and nutrition in Ireland. Even before the current pandemic struck, 1 in 8 Irish households were regarded as suffering from food poverty. The circumstances of economic austerity and increasingly precarious employment faced by many lower income households, in particular since the financial crash of 2010, resulted in increasing numbers presenting at food banks. Now, this is not a distinctly Irish problem. In 2018, around 800,000 tonnes of food products were distributed to nearly 10 million people via charitable organisations across Europe. And of course, the pandemic has significantly exacerbated this problem. As families try to get by on PUP payments, that is, they qualify. So the issue of food redistribution through charitable organisations may, at first glance, appear to be a win-win to redirect surplus food from landfill to feeding hungry people. But in my view, it does not demonstrate a societal commitment to the human right to food, and it certainly doesn't deliver food security with dignity. So these are the foundational principles around which to build a more inclusive food system. Indeed, for many, it's been described as the use of leftover food for left behind people, and other social policy analysts have argued that the charitable food distribution model has become part of the problem of food insecurity as opposed to part of the solution. Above all, I suppose, this issue of surplus food demonstrates the structural nature of industrial food systems that are characterized by mass manufacturing of highly processed foods, leading to huge surpluses, which we could arguably say are then dumped on the so-called needy. We learned from last week's dialogue that we also have in Ireland one of the highest rates of overweight and obesity in Europe. And this is not, again, a question of irresponsibility on the part of consumers, but the logical outcome of a food system delivering unhealthy diets, again, particularly to those on low incomes. Around 70% of mortality is linked to non-communicable diseases, most of which are diet-related. In the EU, NCDs are thought to cost around €700 billion annually to member states of the European Union. We might also note that senior health professionals in the NHS last year submitted a document to the UK government highlighting the pressure that the NHS was under as a consequence of diet-related chronic diseases. Their statement argued for serious policy measures to regulate junk food and to encourage more plant-based food consumption. If we know what constitutes a healthy diet, it's worth reminding ourselves that barely 1% of the Irish population eats in line with the food pyramid, and not, I don't think, not even 40% of their population are getting their 5 a day. And this is because the food environment in which we live is one which promotes energy-dense, micronutrient-poor foods and beverages. Products which are high in saturated fats, sugar and salt are tasty, cheap and ubiquitous, and responsible for a public health crisis. Yet, in spite of this knowledge, we continue to focus on pulling out drowning people from the river, some of whom, of course, as we heard last week, become the patients of Dr. Donal O'Shea, without ever asking why people are falling in upstream. We must begin to ask questions of the obesogenic food environment in our towns and cities that encourages people to eat badly, if cheaply, if we want to build a healthier food system for the future. Now, to speak of a food system is, of course, to broaden this perspective beyond agriculture, and it is to recognise the interconnected concerns of health, of well-being, but also the diverse cultural meanings that food has, the skills, knowledge, and self-esteem that it can promote, and its role in strengthening community. And this was a point made last week by Brenda Dunford and Kathleen, who spoke very well on this topic. Food, then, is arguably a wellspring of so much more than economic exchange. And it is many of these diverse attributes beyond the economic that might provide the means for inclusion. Before we look at some of the methods that might bring people more into the food system, I want to briefly turn my attention to the term sustainability, which features strongly in the 2030 strategy and is widely used by the industry to promote its green credentials. I have to say that when I see the term sustainability applied so frequently across the sector, I have to think of Harry Potter. Harry, as many of you know, had an invisibility cloak that allowed him to move through the corridors of Hogwarts without being spotted by Professor Snape. I think sustainability is often deployed in much the same way, as a cloak to conceal the hard evidence that industrial agriculture exerts a high environmental burden. So when, or if we use an outdated notion of sustainability, which is made up of social, economic and environmental circles, if you like, and we think of trading them off between them, and where in reality we know that the economic ordinarily trumps all with recourse to claims of efficiency, it's time to ask, does sustainability still fit in the 21st century? It's worth reminding ourselves again that this term sustainability really derives from the 1987 Brundtland Report, Our Common Future, which drew our attention to the importance of thinking about future generations. But in the same way that Ireland has changed immeasurably since 1987, so has our understanding of what sustainability represents. It's simply more than a trade-off between these three broad concepts. For some of us who've been working on sustainability for some time, and here I'd like to give a shout out to my colleagues at UCC, because we've recently produced 2 books on the topic, we've come to appreciate, I think, in that respect, the need for a deeper, more robust conceptualization than the conceptualization that's been used hitherto. So I want to just pick out very briefly 3 points that I think should inform our understanding as we go forward. First, health, and Dr. Barry Walsh mentioned health in her opening remarks. Thinking about human, animal and planetary health are indispensable dimension of a reinvigorated sense of sustainability. And of course, these interconnections of these 3 dimensions have been made very, very clear by the emergence of COVID-19. A planetary health perspective helps us to frame the limits in which to live if we wish future generations, or even the young people of today, to have prospects of a safe and secure existence. The second dimension of a more robust conception of sustainability is the need for a holistic, transdisciplinary and systemic approach that recognizes the partial, contingent and variable nature of our understanding, and how we must build greater resilience and redundancy into our production and consumption practices. If that sounds like jargon, then let me put it to you this way. Foot to the floor productivism aiming to achieve ambitious export targets cannot be concealed by a cloak of sustainability. Third, finally, for the moment, is the changing ethical frame of reference. Again, if we contrast the Ireland of 1987 with what we see today, we see an utterly different ethical landscape. And in that respect, just think of the proposals for constitutional reform that have arisen from the Citizens' Assembly in their deliberations around particularly women's rights have really been transformative in that respect. So the work is yet finished. But I would contend that ethical framework, that changing ethical framework, is also changing more broadly, more widely in relationship to our understanding of our place in the natural world. There is no longer a sense in which we have God-given rights to rule over the earth, but must begin to accept a relationship of coexistence with other species. This brings with it, of course, this recognition brings with it a responsibility to act on this understanding. So if we want to be leaders in an inclusive zero carbon future, we're not starting from the best place, but this is where we find ourselves, locked into a path-dependent thinking on producing often more high carbon agri-commodities. Now, this is not only environmentally problematic, I would argue that it could become more economically precarious. For notwithstanding efforts to prove the superior efficiency of grass-fed cattle, the evidence points to the fact that we have a highly specialized and unbalanced agricultural system oriented more to the outside world than to the domestic market. Ireland imports around 80% of its food, feed and beverage needs, amounting to over 10 billion euro of imports last year. Now that, I think, will surprise many people. And it reveals, of course, that the trade surplus on agri-food is smaller than we might be led to believe. And of course, this structure, this imbalance does not support domestically a sustainable, secure or healthy food system. Yet we persist with promoting agri-commodities that are increasingly the subject of intense scrutiny and criticism, if not here, then certainly overseas. In the first dialogue session, Laura Burke spoke of the serious reputational risk we face with continuing claims to being clean and green when the evidence is increasingly demonstrating otherwise. It's not rhetorical extravagance to anticipate that beef might soon be regarded as a toxic product, even to be represented, I argue, controversially, as the new tobacco. And this analogy may come as something of a shock, but the fact is that what we know about big tobacco's efforts in concealing the evidence that smoking is deleterious to health. But yet, it's worth asking, which country achieved international recognition for its successes in tobacco control in the interests of public health? It's Ireland. And so how did it do this? Well, it did it through a combination of leadership and willingness to challenge vested interests in favour of the greater public good. So the food system, I would argue, needs public policy to regulate, restrict and incentivise, just as health-centred policies have rolled out smoking cessation supports alongside taxation measures, bans and so on. A food policy, not an agri-export strategy, brings our attention back to the domestic level and does so by joining up different elements of public policy that are too often disconnected. Health, of course, environment, planning, rural development, education, one could add to that list. And of course, an effective national food policy would find innovative ways to ensure the inclusion of many voices beyond that of business, such that citizens themselves can make themselves heard and thereby unleash the potential of participation, accountability, transparency, empowerment, and dignity. These elements enable us to embark upon the progressive realization of the right to food. As we move forward into the post-COVID era, there is much talk of building back better. Inevitably, in light of COVID, but also Brexit, priority is given to agricultural productivism and the 2030 strategy as a means to boost economic growth. This is understandable. But any notion of building back better must involve a reimagination of our food system that is healthier, more sustainable and inclusive. Clearly, this needs to begin by recognizing that any change of direction in agriculture must involve farmers in a way that does ensure a just transition. But a better food system also needs to embark upon a participatory dialogue with citizens. Many communities are waking up to the possibilities of being more engaged with their food. They want to assert a sense of agency beyond that simply as a consumer. There are a multitude of initiatives emerging, not only in Ireland, but around the world. Food is increasingly entangled with claims for greater social justice, cultural identity, and community empowerment. Calls for food sovereignty, the right of a people to determine their own food system, is now heard loudly and persistently in the corridors of FAO in Rome. I'm disappointed that it seems to be conspicuously absent from the agenda of the Food System Summit. Which brings me finally back to the real capital. We know that Cork is the food capital of Ireland for the history and quality of its produce, but it also has its share of deprivation and exclusion. Now, these are challenging issues, but one of the things that has been developed in Cork is an effort to try to use food as a way of enabling people to empower themselves through skills acquisition, through healthier eating, and through social connection. In 2013, we established the Cork Food Policy Council as a civil society organisation supporting interagency collaboration in helping to bring people together and to point a way forward towards a more sustainable local food system. We've had successes and setbacks, as all such initiatives face. And we've been a little disappointed that the City Council has been unable to provide more tangible financial support. But the exercise of working with the local authority has been instructive, I hope for them as well as for ourselves, and the outcomes have included much greater public engagement around food, with community gardens and other greening initiatives springing up around the city. Ultimately, it is at local level where we can make the most difference, but by fostering a sense of food citizenship. In Cork, we've barely begun to scratch the surface, but we see how rich and rewarding this work can be in helping to improve people's lives. While action is local, policy still needs to come from a national level, providing the incentives that support local efforts, but also guide population level impacts through impacts and restrictions. So to conclude, I'd say that food banks are unfortunately likely to be a fact of life for a while yet, but we should be working to reduce the numbers of people that present themselves for emergency rations, not celebrate the ever greater volumes of food waste that is being redistributed. This demonstrates a failure of a food system, not a success. This is part of the challenge that we face in working for greater contributive justice and inclusion in our food system. Thank you.
And thank you, Dr Colin Sage, for what was really a challenging and a provocative address, and we look forward to addressing a lot of the themes you've raised there with our panel.